Arnold Corll was 31 years of age when he began a 3-year crime spree that included the abduction, rape, torture, and murder of at least 28 boys and young men. Arnold Corll was also known as the Candyman because he and his family had previously owned and operated a candy factory in the Houston Heights area, and he had been known to give free candy to local children. Between 1970 and 1973, Corll is known to have killed a minimum of 28 victims. All were males aged 13 to 20, the majority of whom were in their mid-teens. Most victims were abducted from Houston Heights, which was then a low-income neighborhood, northwest of downtown Houston. In most of these abductions, he was assisted by one or both of his teenage accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Hinlin. Several victims were friends of one or both of Corll's accomplices. Others were individuals with whom Corll had himself become acquainted prior to their abduction and murder. Two other victims, Billy Bulch and Gregory Malleywinkle, were former employees of Corll Candy Company. Corll's victims were usually lured into either one of the two vehicles he owned, the Ford Econoline van or a Plymouth GTX. The enticement was typically an offer of a party or a lift, and the victim would be driven to Corll's house. At Corll's residence, the boys would be supplied with alcohol and/or drugs until they passed out, tricked into donning handcuffs, or simply grabbed by force. They were then stripped naked and tied to either Corll's bed or a plywood torture board, which was regularly hung on a wall. The plywood torture board was the Candyman's preferred choice. Once manacled, the victims would be sexually assaulted, beaten, tortured, and later killed. Their bodies would then be tied in plastic sheeting and buried in one of 4 places: a rented boat shed in southwest Houston, a beach on the Bolivar Peninsula, a forest near Lake Sam Rayburn, or Corll's family owned a lakeside cabin, or a beach in Jefferson County. In several instances, Corll forced his victims to either phone or write to their parents with explanations for their absence in an effort to ease the parents' fears for their son's sake. He is also known to have retained keepsakes, usually keys, from his victims. During the years in which he abducted and murdered his victims, Corll often changed dresses. However, until he moved to Pasadena in the spring of 1973, he always lived in or close to Houston Heights. Corll killed his first known victim, an 18-year-old college freshman named Jeffrey Conan, on September 25, 1970. Conan vanished while hitchhiking with another student from the University of Texas to his parents' home in Houston. The friend was dropped off alone at the corner of Westheimer Road and South Boss Road, near the uptown area of Houston, at approximately 6:15 p.m. Corll likely offered Conan a ride to his home, which Conan eventually accepted. At the time of Conan's disappearance, Corll lived in an apartment where he had recently paid a deposit of a month's rent on September 21st. Shortly after Conan's murder, David Owen Brooks interrupted Corll in the act of sexually assaulting 2 teenage boys, whom Corll had strapped to a 4-poster bed. Corll promised Brooks a car in return for his silence. Brooks accepted the offer, and Corll later bought him a Grange Chevrolet Corvette. Corll later told Brooks that he had killed the 2 boys and offered him $200, a current-day equivalent of about $1,600, for any boy he could lure to Corll's apartment. On December 13, 1970, Brooks lured 2 14-year-old Spring Branch boys named James Glass and Danny Gates away from a religious rally being held at Houston Heights, the Corll's apartment. Those boys were tied to opposite sides of Corll's torture board and subsequently raped, strangled, and buried in a boat shed he had rented on November 17th. An electrical cord with alligator clips attached to each end was buried alongside Yates's body. 6 weeks after the double murder of Glass and Yates, on January 30th, 1961, Brooks and Corll encountered 2 teenage brothers, Donald and Jerry Waldrop, walking toward their home. Those boys were enticed into Corll's van and driven to an apartment Corll had rented on Mangum Road on the northwest side of Houston, where they were raped, strangled, and subsequently buried in the boat shed. Between March and May 1971, Corll abducted and killed 3 victims, all of whom lived at Houston Heights, and all of whom were buried towards the rear of the boat shed. In each of these abductions, Brooks is known to have been a participant. One of these 3 victims, 15-year-old Randall Harvey, was last seen by his family, on the afternoon of March 9th, cycling towards the Oak Forest neighborhood, where he worked part-time as a gas station attendant. Arby was driven to Corll's Mangum Road apartment, where he was subsequently killed by a single gunshot to the head. The other two victims, 13-year-old David Hilligeist and 16-year-old Gregory Malley-Winkle, were abducted and killed together on the afternoon of May 29th. Both were murdered at an apartment Corll rented on West 11th Street in the Houston Heights area. On January 20th, 1973, Corll moved to an address on Work Road in the Spring Branch district of Houston. Within 2 weeks of moving into the address, he had killed 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. Miles was known to both Corll and Brooks. He had lived on Antoine Drive, the same street upon which Brooks resided in 1973. On March 1st, Corll vacated his Work Road apartment. He briefly resided in an apartment on South Post Oak Road before moving to 2020 Lamar Drive, an address his father had recently vacated in Pasadena, Texas. No known victims were killed between February 1st and June 4th, 1973. Around the time of Lyle's murder, Elmer Wayne Henley, Dean Corll's other accomplice, spontaneously traveled to Florida with a long-distance truck driver uncle before temporarily relocating to Mount Pleasant in an apparent effort to distance himself from Corll. These facts may account for this sudden lull in killings. Nonetheless, from June, Corll's rate of killings increased dramatically, and both Henley and Brooks later testified to the increase in the level of brutality of the murders committed while Corll resided at Lamar Drive. Henley later compared Corll's escalation to being, and I quote, like a bloodlust, end quote, adding that he and Brooks would instinctively know when Corll was about to announce that he, quote, needed to do another boy, end quote, due to the fact that he would appear restless, smoking cigarettes and making reflex movements. On June 4th, Henley and Corll abducted 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence. The boy was last seen alive by his father on 31st Street in the Heights. After 3 days of abuse and torture, Lawrence was strangled before being buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Less than 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn was abducted, strangled, and also buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. On July 6, 1973, Henley began attending classes at a driving school in Beryl Era, where he became acquainted with 15-year-old Homer Louis Garcia. The following day, Garcia telephoned his mother to say he was spending the night with a friend. He was shot and left to bleed to death in Corll's bathtub before he was buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. 5 days later, on July 12, 17-year-old John Sellers of Orange County was bound, shot to death, and buried at High Island Beach. In July 1973, after Brooks married his pregnant fiancée, Henley temporarily became Corll's sole procurer of victims, assisting in the abduction and murder of 3 Houston Heights boys between July 19th and 25th. Henley claimed these 3 abductions were the only 3 that occurred after his becoming an accomplice to Corll, in which Brooks was not a participant. One of these 3 victims, 15-year-old Michael Bulch, brother of previous victim Billy Bulch, was last seen by his family on July 19th, on his way to get a haircut. He was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. The other 2 victims, Charles Cobble and Marty Ray Jones, were abducted together on the afternoon of July 25th. Henley himself later buried both boys' bodies in the boat shed. On August 3, 1973, Corll killed his last victim, a 13-year-old boy from South Houston named James Stanton Dramala. Dramala was abducted by Corll while riding his bike in Pasadena and driven to Lamar Drive upon the pretense of collecting empty glass bottles to resell. At Corll's home, Dramala was tied to Corll's torture board, raped, tortured, and strangled with a cord before being buried in the boat shed. Brooks later described Dramala as, and I quote, a small blonde boy, end quote, for whom he had bought a pizza and in whose company he had spent 45 minutes at Corll's home before the boy was attacked. The crimes, which became known as the Houston mass murders, came to light only after Henley fatally shot Corll. For their roles in the murders, Elmer Henley was sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year prison sentences, and David Brooks was sentenced to life in prison without parole.